Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 10 a.m. version of our second in a series of quarterly safety webinars called Effective Safety Management Systems That Drive Results. I wanted to just make everybody aware, we're using the internal GoToWebinar audio system today. You can call in, as you saw on the last slide, if you'd like to. But everyone's going to remain on mute, so we reduce the background noise during this presentation. If you do have a question, please use either the chat function in the GoToWebinar box on the right side of your screen, or use the questions capability. And while our presenter is talking, I will monitor questions, and we'll try to make sure that we get as many of your questions answered as we can. We expect the formal presentation to last about 45 minutes, so that'll leave us plenty of time at the end for a pretty serious Q&A session with you all. So, that being said, let me introduce our presenter. He is, once again, as we had last quarter, Steve Yates. Steve is a longtime safety consultant, founder and president of a company called Optimum Safety Management. Optimum is a member of MSCI, and Optimum has volunteered to help us put on these quarterly safety webinars on an ongoing basis. You should also know that Steve is a certified leadership coach, and it's one of his passions to develop leaders within his clients' organizations, and I think that's an important thing to talk about when it comes to safety. So, without anything further from me, let me introduce you to Steve, and let's get going. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar today. We are excited to present a topic to you that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is the topic of effective safety management systems. I want to just begin this morning by giving a brief background of my experience in developing the systems that you're going to look at today. I think it will help everybody to have some perspective. As a young man starting out with an engineering background in the manufacturing and engineering arena, I discovered that I had a pretty significant bent towards entrepreneurialism in business. And as I began my career, I quickly opened my own business and began a manufacturing consulting practice. I happened to be working for a company in the Aurora area, Aurora, Illinois, when we got inspected by OSHA and we couldn't spell safety. And what I quickly discovered was that there was a whole side to my engineering background that I could put to work in the endeavor of helping people not get injured at work. And when I was able to do that, I was also able to reduce costs and save profits for a business owner. And that fired up my entrepreneurial bent even more. And the three of those things aligning caused me about 18 years ago to retool my engineering background for environmental health and safety. And 18 years later, I have a consulting practice here at Optimum Safety where we are serving over 95 different organizations. The reason that I tell you that is not a commercial or an advertisement for us, but just to let you know that the approaches that you're going to be looking at today are proven. And we've had to develop those to be very systematic in our approaches to the way that we manage our clients' safety management systems. So what I want to do today is give you these systems as a point of discussion that will help to drive a return on investment for your business. As an entrepreneur, I don't do anything within my own business without a return on investment. As a business owner, I'm constantly looking at where we're going to spend money and how we're going to gain a return. And many of you own a business that you're operating within, or you manage a significant portion of it for your business owner or the board of directors there. We're very concerned about making sure that we drive a return on investment. And if you're not, you need to be. Safety is often looked at as a necessary evil and something that's an overhead and expends capital. We need to find a return. We need to be fiscally prudent for the business owners and the board of directors that we serve in making sure that as safety professionals and managers, operations managers, or whatever angle you come at this from, that you're driving a return on investment for that business. So what I hope to do today is, by describing some of these systems that we utilize, is to give you some actionable principles that you can use to move your program to the next step. I want to just address one potential concern on the webinar today, is that we have a great number of attendees on this webinar today, and there will be people at all different levels. There'll be people that are safety professionals on this call, where many of the principles that I'm teaching and talking about are going to be second nature to you. There are going to be those who are maybe HR professionals or operations folks who are just recently tasked with safety within your organization. At the different annual meeting, for instance, we were just at, I met a gentleman there, vice president of one of the members, who's recently installed somebody in the safety position in his organization. So I know that people like that are on the call. So I want to address things at a number of different levels. I'm just going to ask that those that are more seasoned, that you look into these principles, and maybe this is a great time for you to do a gap analysis of your own. How are we doing on these different topics, and kind of evaluating and seeing where there's room for improvement. Safety professionals all know there's always room for improvement in the systems that we have in place in our organization. So utilize this time for that. And with that background, I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. What you're looking at on the screen is our typical system. You can imagine, with over 95 different clients, we have to run a very systematic approach, and we keep everything as simple as possible so that we can understand it, digest it, and integrate it into a client's facility. So one of the first things that we talk about with our client companies is management commitment. It is the cornerstone that all of safety management systems are laid upon. So I want to spend a few minutes here and talk about what drives management commitment to safety. When we look into the mind of management and ownership of a business, what are the things that will cause them to do some things towards safety that other organizations won't do? And I've got some things keyed up here just for discussion. One is an incident or an injury, some sort of a catastrophic event that might occur within the workplace that causes management to get committed to safety. It's an aha moment that occurs where all of a sudden they have an experience and they say, you know, I really don't want that to happen again. I've actually stood in front of a funeral home with a gentleman who was a client of mine at the time, and we had a mutual business contact whose son had passed, and we were about to walk into the funeral home, and he was standing outside very nervous and shaking and smoking a couple of cigarettes and trying to calm down before he walked in. And I said, hey, Jeff, what's going on? What's troubling you? And he said, every time I walk into these places, I have to think about the day that I was at the wake for one of my workers who fell at work and died. He had a worker fall 50 feet out of an aerial lift and died on impact. And he says, every day every time I walk into these, I think about the day where I had to walk by that guy's widow, knowing that I could have done more to save that person from dying at work. I don't want to start this out very heavy, but that is definitely something that will drive management commitment. And if we can get that locked in before that event occurs, we can really avoid those types of incidents from occurring. So definitely a motivator. Another point that we see motivate managers and owners of businesses to get committed to safety is some of the metrics around safety that get measured and then are negative. Things like the DART rate, which is the days away restricted or transferred work rate, that relates to your OSHA record keeping. All of your OSHA record keeping can be benchmarked against your industry using your NAICS code and information that's available on the BLS, that's Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BLS.gov website. They keep track of sample data from all the different industries, and you can actually benchmark your company against others in your industry to see how well you're doing. Your EMR, for those who are not aware of that number, it's your experience modification rate, and that's utilized by your insurance carrier to determine how much or how little you will pay for workers' compensation insurance. That is a major cost for many businesses. It's a large portion of your overheads, and we want to make sure that we maintain a good safety program, because if that gets out of control, management will have to get committed to safety just to get that number back into control. Another item that drives management commitment would be morality. We'd like to think that this is a large motivator, and in my 18 years of experience, I can tell you that oftentimes it's almost sickening how little this plays into a company becoming motivated towards safety. We ought to be concerned about the people that come to work with us or work for us, just as if they were a family member or a child of ours. We wouldn't want to see them get hurt at work, but unfortunately that's often overlooked. We can do some things to try and help motivate management by bringing this to the forefront, but it is all too often not a very good motivator, unfortunately. OSHA. So we used to say that the bigger stick than OSHA was the insurance carrier, because OSHA was not very strong going back prior to the Obama administration. Not a political comment in any way, but this current administration has given OSHA a lot of power, and OSHA is definitely back in the enforcement business, to quote their interim director when he first took over. They are back in the enforcement business and driving a lot of enforcement activity. It is an extreme motivator, and if it's not, it should be. We have companies that are really being targeted and taken to task by OSHA in a big way. So very extreme motivator. Next one is rising workmen's compensation insurance costs. I touched on this a little bit with the EMR, but these costs can be significant, and when they start to rise, management will take notice, as it does impact the bottom line directly. There are many others. These are just a sampling of some of the ones that we see as pretty typical. What I want to talk about now is, so once these things motivate management, the question is, what happens right after we come out of the gate? So management gets motivated and committed towards safety, and immediately they run into some hurdles. Or if you're the operations manager or the safety director at your facility, and you're trying to get management committed towards safety, you'll run into these hurdles the second that you begin, or often you will. We want to just talk about them and get some open discussion going on how do we get over these. So cost is often an initial hurdle. There are cost impacts to doing things safely. You have to upgrade equipment, maybe upgrade some processes, and so on. I will tell you that quite often, in fact, many times, almost all the time, that we implement safety best practices within a workplace, we find cost reductions in productivity. It may sound a little odd, but I would just tell you that if you require your operations staff to operate safely, they will figure out how to get it done as well efficiently. It's just like quality standards. They typically improve your bottom line productivity. And in the case of cost, when we get into safety practices, we often, if not always, see a return on investment, in particular in the case of workers' compensation insurance. So this is a case study on a client that we had that had a very high EMR. So at a 1.23, they were paying about 23% higher than they should have been for their workers' compensation insurance. At the point where they get down to 1, they pay what their industry average is, and then below that, they're actually saving money. And you can see here, after about an 18-month period, we had a pretty significant impact on their workers' compensation costs, about 14%. Getting into the following year then, additional reductions. And after about a 2.5-year period, they were only 0.02 over the minimum EMR for their industry. They will actually never go below a certain level, and they were right at that level. So those are significant. And if you track your EMR and your workers' compensation cost, you could actually run some interesting metrics and show management how your safety program is paying dividends. So these are things to know and to be aware of and begin to track. Another obstacle or hurdle that we hear frequently is time. This is going to take too much time. We don't have time to do that. The old saying that I hear a lot is, there's always time to go back and do it right the second time. What we want to do is we want to get it done right the first time. So to illustrate this point, we often teach from Stephen Covey's time quadrants, the time management matrix that he taught on years ago, as he wrote books like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. What he discussed was that all of the time that we spend, whether it's just general in life or within the work environment, can be broken down into 4 quadrants. And those quadrants relate to either urgent or not urgent, important or not important. And his discussion centered around staying out of tasks that are not urgent and not important. Trivia games, busy work, you'll see some different examples. New examples for today's era would be Facebook during work hours. Unfortunately, Candy Crush for those who are Candy Crush players. I know that's bad news, but should be staying out of that activity. It's a time waster, right? The other thing we want to stay out of is urgent tasks that are not important. So this would be things like telemarketers calling your office. They're urgent because the phone on your desk is ringing, but they're not important to your work environment. Where we all spend the bulk of our time, it's kind of like our home button on your web browser, is in the urgent and important. These are the crises that happen during your day, scrap issues or quality issues within your plant, things that scream for your attention all throughout your day that you literally have to drop what you're doing and go and address because they are your job, they are your business. Where we need to be spending our time is over here in the not urgent but important box. This is where we, like you see the crystal ball graphic there, this is where we do our forecasting and our planning. This is where we step back from the busyness of the day and we actually get some planning done. We look at building relationships with the people around our business that are going to help us to move initiatives forward. It's where we do things like program development and many of the things that we're going to talk about throughout this webinar. The problem that all of us have is that our home button gets bigger and bigger every year and it crowds these things out unless we're diligent about working through, holding that back, delegating activities that other people can do, and moving more into that not urgent but important planning. So hopefully that's some good discussion for you to think through on your day-to-day activities and how you might get into more of a planning activity and overcome this time hurdle. The third one is knowledge. Quite often we get pushed into a position of handling safety where we have more of an operations background or an engineering background or HR. Safety is a delegated task often without a dedicated safety professional within the facility. So the question is, if that's who I am and that's what I've been delegated, now where do I begin? What is it that I can do to begin to bolster my strength and knowledge? And the people that we have that are working within our safety environment, within our plants, what is it that we need to do to help them get up to speed? Often we find deficiencies in management training. People that really don't understand the need to commit to safety, why it's important, what priority it plays. So we should spend some time doing some of that type of training. Leadership training, extremely critical. We have people that have glass half empty mentality. That will be very difficult to get them to look proactively at an environment. And we need to, borrowing one of John Maxwell's terms, we need to raise their leadership lid and help them to see beyond where they've all already been so that they can see that there's more out there. Need to be able to help build some safety management system theory so that people understand how the basic activity that you're asking them to do for your safety management system fits with the overall. Things like OSHA 30-hour courses can be very effective for helping build hazard awareness across your organization for the people who are going to play a role in your safety committee or safety leadership team and so on. And then specific training topics for things like confined space entry or forklift safety. If we're going to ask somebody to be involved in running our forklift training program, they need to have specific training in things like train the trainer so they can understand how to properly and adequately train the people that they're working with. As far as hurdles, you may be thinking there's some others that you encounter at your workplace or that you've come across recently, I want to encourage you to send those in to Chris during the presentation, that we can anonymously discuss some of those things during our Q&A time. This is often where the rubber meets the road and creates an ineffective implementation of a safety management system. If we can overcome these hurdles, things run smoothly. So let's spend a little bit of time there in the discussion time. So now we've got management commitment. Management is bought in. They want to move. They want to have some good experience with their safety management system. They're willing to commit some time and resources to it. I liken that to the flesh of the program. What we need to do now is we need to give that flesh a framework to hang on. And that would be our pardon me. That would be our program development. What we want to do when we think about program development is we want to look back to a task for safety professionals called a job hazard analysis. This is a process of looking at each and every one of the different tasks or processes that are in place within your manufacturing facility and look at each of the tasks that's required in order to produce that product or that process, and then analyze each task and look at the hazards that are applicable to that task. Once you understand what the hazards are, the process of job hazard analysis then talks about building the controls. So an example of this would be if we are going to be using a piece of equipment to slit coil, that task may be loading that coil machine to perform that slitting operation. Our hazard might be lacerations, amputations, those types of things. The controls are going to be proper lockout tagout, proper machine guarding. Those types of controls would be put in place. You might have some personal protective equipment with cut-resistant level 5 gloves, so that as the workers are handling the edges of those coils, that they're not going to be lacerated and so on. Whatever the controls are that come out, those controls need to be addressed in a safety and health program. So this is an example of that. You see here a lockout tagout program, control of hazardous energy. The reason that we need programs in place is because we've done a job hazard analysis, and that's evidenced a need for that program. You do need to understand the OSHA standards so that you know when we implement things like lockout tagout programs, there's also a requirement for procedures. So each of the pieces of equipment within your facility that have more than one energy source need to have a lockout tagout procedure in place. So you'll see here some different examples of procedures we've developed for different types of equipment, mixers or food processing equipment. And you'll see that we list all of the different electrical and pneumatic and water and gravity and hydraulic energy sources. And we show where those are to be locked out so that the operator or the maintenance engineer that has to lock this equipment out knows where to go and find those devices. And then you can see right at the top of the procedure, it tells them, you're going to need 4 locks and tags for this. You're going to need 9 locks and tags. It'll actually give them the equipment they need before they even get there to do the work. OSHA actually requires that this process of job hazard analysis is performed within the workplace to determine what all the hazards are. And they also require that a personal protective equipment hazard analysis is performed. That's the controls that would require the employee to wear a hard hat or safety glasses or face shield or respirator, some other type of personal protective equipment. OSHA requires that that analysis is done and documented, and then that you further train your employees on it, and that you have that training available that OSHA can review in the event that they come in to see your workplace. So we want to make sure that all of those things are in place in your program development. Those are all going to form the foundation now for your training programs. When we begin to talk about training, what we want to do is remember that we cannot expect people to do things that we're not willing to tell them about. So when Optimum looks at training, we look at it in 3 distinct buckets, 3 distinct categories. The first is initial training. when we see an employer hire a brand new employee to come to work for them, we want to make sure that that employer teaches the employee about the culture of safety that they're trying to develop within their organization. That can have a statement or a quick video clip from the CEO or a prominent figure at the organization talking about their commitment to safety for this new employee. And then it should have the aspects of basic training, things like the global harmonization standard, personal protective equipment, general requirements for the plant, forklift policies, yellow markings on the floors where the employee can walk and cannot walk, general safety requirements that the employee should understand before reporting to work. And then depending on the department that they're assigned to, it's generally a great idea to have things like department-specific orientations that now when I go to work in that department, I begin to understand more about the equipment that I'm working with and the specifics to that department. When we talk about the specific training category, these are job-specific. So if I'm going to be required to remove a guard and grease some equipment or adjust a chain, I've got to remove the guarding. That means I need to have lockout, tagout training and be an authorized person for that before I can actually do that work. Or things like forklift operator. If I'm going to have to operate a forklift, I need to have training at that facility specific to that facility for that job task. So we want to make sure that we're training our workers to the job-specific tasks. A great way to keep track of that is that you would have a grid or a matrix that shows all of your job descriptions across the top. Down the vertical side would be a list of all the different trainings that are required for your entire workforce. And then the matrix is just a check mark in the boxes that apply to each job description. That way you think through it once. When HR hires somebody, they know exactly what training they need to have. The ongoing training would be more of a weekly toolbox talk topic, something that keeps people refreshed and on top of thinking about safety. And so it's forefront in their mind. It's typically best to do this on a Monday morning, right at the beginning of the first shift, right when they start their work week. They kind of shake the weekend off and realize they're back at work, and I've got to get my head back in the game because I'm working with heavy equipment and I want to be safe. It's also a good place to get your compliance training done. This is things like your GHS annual training requirements, lockout, tagout affected persons, and so on. So it's a great place to check off your compliance requirements. All right, so we talked about management commitment, we've talked about program development and now training, and now we want to remember that we need to inspect what we expect, and that's where safety surveys come in. This is a feedback loop in your management system. So any good management system sets out with objectives and purposes, and we always want to check back and see how we're doing. Otherwise, we can go way off track and not realize it and find out later on that the measures we put in place 4 years ago are not still in place, and now we're going to have a compliance problem or we're going to have a litigation issue. There's all different types of risks that can open up if we don't do site safety surveys or some sort of a inspection process. So what you're looking at here is our typical site safety survey when we come in and do this happens to be for a construction site. When we do plant inspections, we keep track of those a little bit more detailed because a lot of those activities that need to take place to remediate a problem or a hazard require a length of time in order to do. They're not quick fixes. They require new equipment or a concrete pad to be poured or some different type of fix there. So you'll see here that we track those across the sheet here with then tracking columns for who's responsible, when it's projected to be completed, is it complete, when did it get complete, and who verified it. And then there's a spot to take some notes. So as we walk through this process, I want to give you a couple of considerations on safety surveys. Be very careful with the use of the term audit. So when we think of audit, we think of CPAs or the IRS, unfortunately, and we think about them coming in and doing an audit where they lift up every stone, they look underneath every rock, they turn everything over and check it. You do not want to call your survey forms an audit. That doesn't bode well in the terms of litigation because the term audit has those connotations. We want to do things like inspections or surveys and those kind of things that just have a little bit lighter feel, and they don't imply that we looked at every single thing and caught every problem. That would be very difficult to do, and it's not something that's really a reasonable expectation for an inspection. The OSHA requirement is that you perform frequent and regular inspections of your workplace. So we often like to say, well, thank you very much, OSHA, for being so descriptive. What does that mean? So we need to establish what that means at your workplace. So based on the hazards that are in place in most of the mills, service centers, processing centers, distribution centers, you have large equipment, large loads, extreme hazards from a crushing, laceration, all those different types of hazards are in place, burns and so on. Frequent and regular means quite often. We want to be doing things like per shift, that operations is walking through the facility, looking at it from a safety standpoint. Each section manager or department manager would be walking through and looking at safety. We want to do things like maybe weekly cross-departmental inspections where you have the managers rotate into each other's department and do a quick walkthrough. So you get fresh eyes and ears on the workplace as you go throughout your week. From a monthly standpoint, maybe you want to have upper management doing a walkthrough. And I'm giving you some suggestions. These are not necessarily recommendations depending on your workplace. You'll really need to tailor this, but you'll want to make sure that you get a frequent enough look at it to identify and remediate any hazards that are in the workplace. Be sure, though, to include an overall annual review to catch compliance gaps. Remember, I talked about your feedback loop. We don't want to let things get too far off track before we find them. One of the things that we find frequently with service centers is the requirement to do an annual inspection by a third party of all of your overhead cranes. We find that they'll start out okay, and then that'll drift, and we come back in year 2 or 3, and we find that those have stopped. The maintenance department manager changed. The new manager came in. He wasn't trained on the requirement to do that annually, and now suddenly we don't have an annual inspection. That can be a major compliance issue for an OSHA inspection. It can also be a major injury potential in the event that something goes wrong with that crane and it's not being caught. So we want to make sure that we're doing an annual to catch those compliance gaps. I do want to talk for a minute about utilizing third-party inspectors for fresh eyes. So I just talked about the compliance requirement for third-party inspection of overhead crane. That's an actual OSHA requirement. Using third-party inspectors to meet your frequent and regular inspections is not necessarily an OSHA requirement, but it can be very helpful for best practice. Bringing people in as a third party, they don't have the same eyes you do looking at your facility. You might jump across a gap every day when you walk through your facility, and the third-party inspector will walk in and they'll look at that and say, why are you doing that? And that's a floor opening, and that needs to have a proper walkway across it or some sort of guard. And you'll all of a sudden be, you have your eyes open to where there's a compliance issue and a potential for injury in your plant that you've literally walked by for years. And I can speak to this from first-hand experience working as a safety director in a facility with several hundred employees under roof. I utilized a third-party consultant, and I utilized some of the, here in Illinois, we have an Illinois on-site consultation program. I utilize them to come in. You have to be careful how you do that because when they come in, whatever they see, you have to fix. And if you don't fix it, they can end up reporting that to OSHA. So if you're going to use the on-site consult programs, make sure you understand the implications of that. You can choke their scope down. So you can say, we want you to come in and look at our forklift program only. And anything else, they kind of turn their eyes off and they don't look at those things for you or report them. You want to be very careful so how you use those, but there are those resources. You also can utilize your brokerage or your workers' comp carrier to do inspections for you. I want to just talk for a minute about aligned incentives or motives, and this is a really important thing, I think, for employers to understand, is that when you invite your workers' compensation carrier to come into your facility to do an inspection of your facility, that inspector works for your work comp carrier. Their reason for being there and offering that service is typically due diligence for their investors in that insurance company. They want to know if there are hazards in your facility that can create a loss, and then based on that loss, impact the profit and loss of the insurance carrier. Anything that they find gets reported back to your underwriters, and it can affect your rates. So we want to be very careful how we utilize that. The other thing to know is that typically most companies will change out their workers' comp carrier about every 3 years. Now that might surprise some of you because you've had the same carrier for many years and you haven't had a loss and everything's good, and that's great. Others, you're thinking 3 years, we change ours every year. Most of the employers that we talk to, they all have different experiences, but the average is about 3 years. So we want to make sure that we understand the motivations behind the carrier coming in, and also then if you're utilizing broker services, now we hear a lot that the brokerage will provide certain services for free, and when I hear that I can get something for free or I can go buy something and it's going to cost me a lot of money, there's a reason for the difference in those, and it's usually, not saying always, but usually a quality or an investment that person's going to make in my system and in my plant. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking through that when we talk about incentives and so on. We've also had people ask us, hey, I'm trying to increase my safety commitment here and my safety culture here at my plant. I'm thinking about inviting OSHA into my facility to look at the facility. And I know, you're all muted. Probably 30 of you just screamed into your microphone, no! And that would be accurate. We wouldn't want to invite OSHA into the facility because anything they find, they'll tell us about, and it's usually in the form of a citation with a penalty. So, we don't want to invite OSHA into our facility typically. There are exceptions, and that's VPP programs and STAR compliance programs and so on, but those are for select companies that are really far advanced in their safety management systems. So hopefully that's not too much on that, but I want to spend a little bit of time here and talk about this misaligned incentives and making sure that you have people looking at your facility who are really on your team and have your best interest at heart. If that generates any questions or you have any thoughts on that, please bring them up for the Q&A. We'd love to entertain any questions on that. Corrective action. So this is the result of the feedback loop. In your feedback loop, when you're doing your surveys, you may find out that management needs to be more committed, or that you have issues with your training program or your program development and so on. This is the place to take that corrective action. And I'm going to use a illustration here to illustrate the point of how this can work for you with an OSHA defense. So I'm teaching you this not so that you know how to just defend yourself against an OSHA citation, but you can use this defense in that regard. I'm showing you this mainly because if you follow this process, you will be on the road to building an effective safety management system. The more that you can follow this program and integrate it and get it to flow down in your organization, the better program you're going to have. So we liken this defense to a four-legged stool. If you have a stool with 4 legs and you have all 4 legs, the stool generally will stand up. But as you start to break the legs off or weaken them, that stool is going to fall over. So what we want to talk about is what are the 4 legs to an employer's only affirmative defense against an OSHA citation. If OSHA walks into your facility and sees one of your employees violating a safety and health standard, the first thing they're going to want to know is, do you have a program related to that violative condition? If the employee has they're standing on a platform and there's no guardrail at its edge and it's over 4 feet, they're going to want to know if you have a fall protection or walking working surface program in your documents. If you have that, you've got that leg. Now the next question they ask is, have you effectively trained workers regarding this hazard? And when we say effectively, we're talking about native language also. And I'm going to hold that for the Q&A. We'll have a little bit more discussion on that during the Q&A, but we've got to make sure that we effectively train the worker. And this is a big drum that OSHA is beating right now. Third item is that you did not have the opportunity to correct the infraction prior to OSHA's observation. So if you notice in the title, it's an unavoidable, isolated employee misconduct offense. So this indicates that you're walking into your facility with OSHA, OSHA stands there, they look up, they see something that's violating a standard, you see it as well, it's the first time you've ever seen it, there's no supervisor standing or watching this employee do it, and you take prompt corrective measures to stop it. That helps you to bolster that leg. And then you've got to prove that it didn't happen before. The fourth leg is that you've enforced the rules via inspections and disciplinary action. This is typically where most employers' defenses fall apart. Number one, because they're not doing effective safety surveys, they're not meeting the requirement to do frequent and regular inspection, or they have not done disciplinary action when they found a problem. A lot of times we see employers that are resistant to writing people up because they don't want to upset their employee. And, you know, I've got to work with this guy all day, or things that, you know, that's something that we hear a supervisor say, I don't want him being my enemy, I need him to be my friend. And our response usually is, you need him to be your friend who is still alive at work instead of your dead friend who you're standing at their wake for. If you don't discipline them, they don't understand the severity of what they're doing, they won't correct it. And you can take an OSHA citation for it, or you can injure the employee. So it's very important that we're thinking about those four legs and that we're walking through those and making sure that we have all four of those in place so that when an OSHA inspector does walk into our facility, we actually have a defense that we can bolster and put up for them, and that we can avoid the citation. But again, the main reason is so that we're running an effective safety management system. Now, we've gone through the bulk of what we would consider to be an effective safety management system. For sake of time, I can't cover this next topic, but I want to offer you a resource that you can go and look at. Through much of the work that we've done with insurance carriers and many of the different employers that we've looked at over the course of my 18-year experience and then the rest of our staff, we've developed a safety management system evaluation process that we utilize when we come in to look at an employer's facility. And we have 30 key performance indicators that we look at. On this slide are many of those KPIs. Many of these that will help you to build good culture within your facility. I'm going to make available a copy of the slides at the end of the presentation here for anyone who'd like them. So you'll have this list, but also on our website at OSHASafetyManagement.com, you'll find under the services menu at the bottom, Safety Management System Assessment. At the bottom of that page, there is a video. It's a YouTube video of about 15 minutes of a presentation I gave at an association event. It happens to be for a contracting group, but all of the principles are transferable to you, and it will describe those KPIs for you. So if you'd like to do a little bit deeper gap analysis on where you're at, and you want to do that yourself and have a look at some of those, feel free to take a look at that video. It's there for your use. So as we close today, and we're going to close here right about 10:45, which is great. We'll have about 15 minutes for we have now about 15 minutes for Q&A. So what I want to do as we're closing is I just want to have you thinking about what are your takeaways for immediate implementation back at your facility. I often go to webinars like this, or I sit in seminars and I take notes, and then I leave them and I don't actually go back and implement things. And I have a pile on my desk usually of different notes I've taken, and I think back on that, it's a shame because there's a lot of learning there, and there are things that I could have done that I didn't do, and that probably would have resulted in our organization being better and things improving. So I don't want to let you do that. I want to have you just take a minute here, even while we're going through Q&A, and just jot down a couple of thoughts that you've had that you can take back and implement within your workplace. And then as we go into Q&A, what concerns do you have as you consider safety management system development at your organization? Are there things that, as I've been speaking about this, you're going, you know, we're not doing that very well, or we do that, but it could be better, but I need to work through an obstacle? If you have things like that, bring them in the Q&A, or we've got a couple of other opportunities coming up where you can field those questions and work through them a bit. So September 17th this year, we're going to be doing our next of our quarterly webinars. We're actually going to look at OSHA compliance for the metals industry. We're going to pull up some of the common NAICS or SIC codes for the metals industry, and we're going to look at what the OSHA citation history is there. And we're actually going to bring some case studies for you and show you some of the things that are impacting your industry. So I want to invite you back for that webinar. I think that'll be a great learning experience for all of us together. And then the cornerstone for safety for MSCI here, the big event for the year, October 12th, 13th, is the safety conference that's being hosted at the Renaissance Convention Center in Schaumburg. This was our first experience with the association last year as we became new members, and I can tell you that it was a great event. There was a lot of good content and a lot of good networking, a lot of good discussion, and then a lot of good feedback. And Chris has worked with your safety committee to really take a lot of that feedback and build an even better conference for this year. So we want to invite you back to that. There's a lot of great speakers. We're going to have a session there, one that's coming to mind right now, on what to do in the event of an OSHA inspection. It's going to be presented by a former OSHA compliance officer as well as an attorney that we work with frequently, and I'll be in that session as well. And we'll be giving you the experience that we've had through many different OSHA inspections and talking about what the compliance officer is looking for, as well as how to defend in the event that you do receive a citation. So we want to have you consider sending your entire safety committee to that seminar, to that conference. It's a great way to get some training for people that you're expecting to do some things related to safety. Free resources, we do have a copy of the webinar slide handouts available. You can send an email request to Safety Helpline at optimum-usa.com. Jessica's looking for those emails, and she will immediately send you back a copy of the slide handouts. And then as well on our website, there's some additional things for blog articles there that you can look to. So at this point, Chris, I want to turn things back over to you to moderate our Q&A time.
Okay, and we actually do have quite a few questions queued up. So I'm going to start at the top in the order in which they were asked, and we'll just work through them. First one, Steve, is about onboarding of new employees, and I think this is probably a common issue. I know a lot of companies do job screening by doing drug testing, and they do background checks. But beyond that, in regard to safety, is there any program or mechanism out there that you know of that would allow people to get a better measure of people's awareness in regard to safety? Personality testing, something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So from a purely safety perspective, well, I'm trying to think now from a like a personality test standpoint that would have safety questions or safety pulse. You know, Chris, I'm at a loss.
Yeah.
Thanks for that being the first one.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's one of the topics that we're going to talk about at the safety conference. I believe there is an hour-long breakout session on the onboarding process, so maybe we can work that into that session.
There is a session on that, and we'll make sure that that's addressed in it. And perfect. I'll do a little investigation here even, and I can try and send something out to you that you can forward to the attendees.
Okay, sounds great.
Excellent.
Second question that was submitted, and this is, I understand, a really common one, but if in fact you've started a safety program, and if in fact you're having trouble getting senior managers to really buy in and be motivated about that program and get them on board, what are some good methods to use to get them to really believe in the process and convey it from the top down?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think coming back to MSCI, this is really and I don't mean this to be another plug, but I have really been impressed with the association, how the organizations that really have a good commitment to safety are at the events and promoting safety, and especially at the safety conference last year, you had a CEO panel that was there. I would just tell you that the more you can get your CEO or president, upper management around safety conscious organizational leaders, the more that they're going to begin to breathe in that air and take on some of those principles. In addition to that, I would say that what we don't want to do is talk compliance to business development leaders who run at a fast pace and are typically more relational in their interactions. They don't necessarily care about being compliant. And I don't mean that in a very derogatory way. It's just not the thing that blips on their radar screen the loudest. So we don't want to talk about, we need to comply with the OSHA standards. We need to make sure that we're following these rules. If you look across the leadership of your organizations, many of them drive motorcycles, have fast sports cars. They're into a little bit more of a fast-paced lifestyle. You've got to speak in a language that actually influences and impacts them. So stay out of the compliance topics. The things to begin to talk with them about are how the risks that we have, and in particular if you've had an event, how those events relate to production impact, how they relate to bottom line profit impact, how they relate to things like business development efforts in press releases and things that will negatively impact their ability to gain new business. There are ways to show safety as a profit center and as a marketing tool. For lack of a better term, safety has become kind of sexy these days. It used to be that it wasn't, and it was just looked upon as an annoyance to business owners and business in general. Here in the U.S., that's changing, and to not be a safety-conscious company is a detriment, especially if that's viewed in the marketplace. So speaking to business owners and managers about those types of topics can usually help to begin to turn the corner for them. It puts it on their radar screen in terms that they can understand. Hopefully that helps to answer that question.
I think so, Steve. Thank you. Another question, and this is somewhat complicated, so we may need to do a little back and forth here. But in regard to disciplinary action, and let's paint a little scenario here where the employee is injured and during the incident, and the employee is found to have been in violation of a company's safety procedures. In regard to disciplinary action in that scenario, Steve, what are your thoughts? Anything in particular?
Yeah, I think the question really relates to if the employee has been injured, do I still recommend that disciplinary action is followed if the employee violated a safety rule? Absolutely. That will not typically, especially here in Illinois, but for those employers in the other states or countries here, that typically will not release you from your obligations under workers' compensation insurance and those kind of things. There may be specific instances of certain states that do have that allowance, or a specific, especially in the case of drug or alcohol use. But you'll have to speak with an attorney in your state for that. But we always recommend, if there's a safety rule that's violated, as a course of your incident investigation, you want to bring out all of the contributing factors. And then each of the contributing factors should have a corrective measure for them. So if the contributing factor relates to a piece of equipment, you're certainly going to correct that and fix it. The same would go with the employee. If the employee violated a safety rule, there needs to be disciplinary action, because that is your corrective measure for that contributing factor. Make sure that you follow your union's guidelines if you're a union shop. Make sure you follow good HR practices and use a step process. Some programs we've seen, and in fact we write programs like this, that state that serious safety infractions will be met with escalated disciplinary action. So you can go right to terminations if you need to, or so on. But yes, definitely I would recommend disciplinary action.
Okay, thank you.
But Chris, one other thought on that too is, oftentimes we'll see employees not report an accident or an incident or injury if it's minor. And that's a violation of most companies' policies as well.
Right.
And you do need to discipline for that. So if you have somebody that cuts their finger and they just put a bandage on it and kind of keep working, that can get infected a few days later. As soon as somebody finds out about that, there needs to be disciplinary action issued for not reporting it, and make sure that's put in the records. That'll help to stem a lot of problems with personal injuries being brought into the workplace. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned during your presentation, when you were talking about effective training, with the word effective in bold letters, a native language issue. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah, thanks for bringing that back around. The concern is that OSHA is becoming more and more intense on this concept of effective training. And I'll just speak to Hispanic workforce, because that's a large example for us here in the U.S., but there are many instances of Eastern European and Vietnamese, Oriental, that kind of thing. We need to be aware that this applies to every language we employ. If we want to employ that worker, we need to effectively train them. OSHA is recognizing that there's a big problem, especially with Latino workers, where they are trained in classroom environments, either in English and don't have an understanding at all of the training, or they're trained with a translator who may not be effectively translating because they're not qualified on the topic, and they're beginning to question translators. They're also beginning to look at things like the slide material is in English, it's spoken in English and then translated in Spanish, but the employee doesn't have the benefit of the written slides in their native language. And they're starting to pick apart all of these different issues to show that training is not effective. So we really need to be careful that we're making sure that we're testing the employee properly to make sure they have a good understanding of the topic, and that's got to be thorough, and that we can prove up that there was an effective training done. You know, no longer just, do you understand? And the employee nods his head vertically and says, see, and you say, okay, well, he understood. That's, you know, that's kind of a play on that, but we've seen a lot of that in the past. They're aware of that and not accepting that. Also understanding that many of the Spanish-speaking workforce that we have here in the U.S. that come out of Mexico have less education nationally than we have here as a recognized standard. So when the newspapers are written here in the U.S., they're written to a 5th grade reading level typically, and many of the workers coming out of Mexico would not be able to read their own native language at that level because of the fact they've been on agricultural workplaces and that kind of thing, family farms and so on. So it's a big concern, and it's a difficult challenge to defeat, but it has to be looked at.
Yeah. Okay. Unfortunately, even though we do have more questions, we're kind of running up against our 11 o'clock Central ending time. But I do want to thank everybody for being on the webinar and participating. We had a lot of participants, and your attendance at these is very much appreciated. First of all, from the safety is a moral imperative issue that Steve mentioned earlier on, because that's what MSCI's Safety Committee has adopted as its basically its motto, that we should all be aiming for a zero accident environment. And then, as Steve said, we'll be offering you access to additional resources. You will be able to get a copy of the slides of this presentation today, because I know there are a lot of questions about how do you get that. You'll see that on the screen here right now. We will also send around a post-webinar questionnaire for you to answer. Hopefully you'll participate in that so that we can continue to make these better and better every time we offer them. And Steve, do you have any other closing comments you wanted to mention before we hang up?
No, I just really want to thank the attendees. We had a great turnout and great questions. I appreciate that, and appreciate the commitment from MSCI to safety as a moral imperative. I think it's great, and it's excellent to see the members rising to that occasion.